Now, any children who are here? Come on up. We have lots of room. I'm going to have you all on the steps up here on the rug, and I'm going to be down here. We'll just have you all kind of sitting in that area, which is great. Your parents want to come up and help. I'm going to say here, guys, you can face me. There's just such a good crowd. It's such an Easter crowd, right? Such a wonderful Easter crowd we have here. Look at you. Got room over here, maybe. Hey, right? You want to have a seat? Everybody find a space. Turn this way. Turn so you can see me. You can stand actually. Either one is fine. Can you see me? Okay. Happy Easter, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all. I know this has been an exciting morning for you already. And you all have probably already done some Easter things, like maybe, I don't know.
I got to Easter.
Honey, Easter eggs? You got an Easter basket? Nice. So Easter has come. There's been some Easter things? Nice. Well, there's a couple different stories going around on Easter, and there's this story about the bunny and the baskets and the eggs and all that good stuff, and that's great. And then there's this other story that I want to tell you this morning. It's a little bit different, but it's a really cool story. And you know what it is? It's a mystery. And I need you all to stand up. Stand up. Give yourself some space. This is a story that involves, well, you need to stretch a little. So reach up high. Reach up high. Okay. Reach up high. Okay, that's good. Now, hand bend down. Okay, that's good. That's good. Now, put your hands on your hips. Get the stretch nice and loose. Okay, good. All right. You can stay standing. Why don't you stand up? Everybody stand up. Because this is a story about standing up. And not only about standing up, but about running. Now, we're not going to run today, but I don't know where that is. This is a story about Mary. One morning, she got up really early. You know how early she got up? Before the sun rose. Have you ever been up that early?
Yeah,
It might be. She got up really early. You know why she got up? Because she was really sad about her friend. Her friend, whose name was Jesus, she had watched just the day before, she had watched her friend die on the cross. And it made her very sad. And she didn't know what to do with herself, so she got up really early and she walked to a cave. So let's, right in place, let's walk. Can you just walk to the cave, walk to the cave. She walked to the cave because that's where they laid Jesus. Behind a big stone in a cave, that's where they laid Jesus. And she got there, and guess what? The stone, that big old stone, had been rolled away. And Mary took a little look inside. She saw things weren't like she thought they would be, and she was a little bit afraid because she wasn't sure what was going on. And then you know what she did? Ran. So let's run in place. She ran, then she stopped running. Stopped running. And she was tired. She was, when you, well, that's a long run. She was tired. And she told her friend, Peter, and his friend, the place where they put Jesus, he's not there anymore. I don't know what happened. The stone was rolled away, and he's not there, and I don't know what to do. What should we do? Peter's still early. Peter's kind of waking up. So waking up, you know how you do when you wake up? You wake up and stretch a little bit. And he said, well, I guess we should go. So he and his friend, they got all ready, and you know what they did? They ran to the cave where Jesus. They ran so fast that they got tired. They stopped running. And they were tired. And they're breathing hard. And they drove into that same cave. And what Mary told them that the cave was empty. Where they put Jesus, it was empty. And they didn't know what to do. It was a mystery. They didn't know what to do. And so they said, Mary, what do you think happened? And Mary said, I'll tell you what happened. Someone took Jesus, and we don't know where they've taken him. That's the beginning of this story. That's a mystery. But what we know now and why we celebrate Easter is that Jesus was gone because he had risen. He somehow, mysteriously, he was alive again. And now we see all these people, and in each of these people is Jesus because he rose and he left that cave. And that was a big day for us. And that's why we celebrate this big day. That's why all these people are here at church today. Because Jesus he wasn't in that cave like we thought he would be. It's Easter. So everybody, on the count of 3, let's all yell out to the folks who are here, he is risen. Hallelujah. Okay? 1, 2, 3. He is risen. Hallelujah. Amen. Thank you all so much. I'm so glad you're here. Now what I'd like for you to do is to go back to your pews. A few of us here this morning might be able to call to mind a mental picture when I say the words Christian Theological Seminary. But most of us would have a hard time imagining this place. What in the world does a seminary look like anyway? Well, this seminary is on the campus of Butler University in Indianapolis, Indiana. It is adjacent to the Indianapolis Museum of Art. It sits above the shores of the White River that winds through town. This place that has done its very best over the years to help many generations of people, men and women, who have felt the call to become ministers, discern the nature and the strength and the direction of that call, and help guide them along the way. Some of us here attended that seminary. Others of us have visited this place, since some have said there's not a whole lot else to do in Indianapolis. The joke we used to tell when we got there all these many years ago was that the flight attendant comes on the intercom as the plane descends. Welcome to Indianapolis, ladies and gentlemen. Please set your watches back 2 decades. It's not like that anymore. Christian Theological Seminary is, in fact, a very interesting building, and some would say even beautiful. But the problem with the building is that it's a pretty big problem. It was built more for beauty than for education, and it was also built just before our consciousness was raised about making buildings accessible to everyone. Which meant in this case that in order to get inside of just about every classroom at Christian Theological Seminary, one had to descend 2 pesky steps and go around a little corner. And in order to go and visit with a professor, professors were the only ones who got to have offices upstairs, one had to ascend a steep and very intimidating stairway into the ivory tower. And in order to get inside the building in the first place, unless you were a visitor with special privileges, one had to park in a parking lot that was a long way from any of the doors. The architect didn't want things like cars messing up the look of the building. And if you've ever seen a minister's car, you might know why. That's not true anymore either. I mentioned all this random information today because of that one night. That one night in late autumn, 1986. There had been a program at Christian Theological Seminary that night, a community program, a clergy community program that both me and my big brother had attended. Now, I have to confess, I have no memory of what the program was about. I do remember, though, that after the program, my brother and I were walking with a few denominational hotshots. We were making our way from the halls of the seminary across that patio along a very long sidewalk that led to the parking lot, where inexplicably there were 3 more steps until you could get to your car. And as we were about to get to the lot, we heard a big gasp, and then the sound of someone hitting the ground. Jim and I both turned around, and there was William Martin Smith, former chief executive of the pension fund of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, giant pillar of the church, lying on the ground, unconscious, already being cradled by his wife, Winnie. someone cried out, "Call 911! Call 911!" And before I think either of us knew it, my brother and I were running back down that long sidewalk, across the patio, to get to the doors we walked out of 5 minutes earlier. I took the early lead, but then I think he pulled in front of me, and then I don't know who ended up getting there first, but I do remember that by the time we got to the door of the auditorium, we were both too winded to really even speak. The first person we saw was Ralph, the maintenance guy who'd been there forever. He was locking up the building. "Dr. Smith, heart attack, find a phone. 911. I know that there is a lot about that night that I don't remember. I don't really remember what happened after we delivered that message. Don't remember if we went back to where all the people had gathered. But the thing I do remember comes to mind every time I hear John's story about the resurrection of Jesus, is that the minute we saw what was before us to see, the minute things just began to become clear, we knew there was no choice, there was no deliberation. We were both compelled to run. Now, I don't want to paint ourselves as heroes here. We were probably running away from what had just scared us to death, as much as we were running toward a foe, which you had to run toward back then. I just remember being on the move, almost before I registered what had happened. And then that long run, it seemed to take forever before we were able to tell the other people the news we had to tell. Now when I read John 20, preparing for Easter, I remember that evening, the confusion and the shock, the running, the news that was ours to deliver, the news that would set everything else in motion. We kind of know the story by now, don't we? Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. Mary saw that the stone had been rolled away, removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Both men looked inside the tomb once they got there. Didn't see much of anything but those clothes. Did what men perhaps too often do. "Oh, we can't fix anything. We're going to go back home." So they go back home and they leave Mary grieving there by herself. But this time I imagine when they went back home, I imagine that they walked. Because walking is especially what people do. Right? Walking is especially what people do when they live in a place that's almost always hot, even at nighttime in the Middle East. Walking is especially what people do when they typically wear clothing that is very difficult to run in, robes and cloaks and cassocks. Walking is especially what people do when running would involve lifting up that clothing and showing off your legs in public, which was only done by men in emergencies and was even more rarely done by women, whose legs, for very good reasons, were almost always covered. Walking is what people do in the Bible, right? The only time people in the Bible typically run is when there's a battle or a race and then they're dressed for it. Walking is what people do in the Bible. The word run is only mentioned half a dozen times in all of the Gospels. Walking is what people in the Bible do. For that matter, walking is what people not in the Bible normally do. I normally walk. You normally walk. I've known some of you for 25 years or more, and I have seen very few of you run. Normally, we walk. Normally, walking is good enough. Normally, walking fills the bill. But early on that first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene ran. Why do you suppose she ran? Don't you think it's because she could do no other thing? I think Mary was gripped by what she saw before her, and she'd taken off before she even knew what had really happened. Just the way it happens for us. We normally walk until we hear the pizza box hit the floor of the kitchen and realize that the dog has disappeared from the living room. Then we run. We normally walk until we look up and can't see our 2-year-old who was just a second ago building a sandcastle near the breakers at the beach. But now she's nowhere to be found. Then we run. We normally walk until a giant at the church collapses right behind us on the sidewalk, and we see him cradled by his wife. Then we run. We normally walk, but sometimes we run. You remember the last time you ran because you could do no other thing? And here's the thing. You know what we all look like when we run? Well, most of us. Maybe not all of us. There's some athletes in the crowd, I know. Most of us look silly when we run, which is why, among many other reasons, we don't do it very often. We look a little silly. Elbows and wrists and knees and feet, and sometimes we might trip. The people of God, hear the good news on this Easter morning. Silly isn't the only way we look when we run. I think we also look like God. I think when we run, we look like the God who runs to us when we are in harm's way. I think when we run, we look like the God whose tears are the very first tears to fall when tragedy visits. I think when we run, we look like the God whose laser focus is our well-being. The God who may not get there in time, but whose desire is to be the very first to arrive when life falls apart a little and death comes our way. I think when we run, we look like the God who finds a way to find us, no matter how long it takes. And sometimes it does take a little while. Sometimes it takes longer than just the first day of the week for God to find us. I watched the Notre Dame Cathedral go up in flames, just like most of you all did this week. It took me back to the evening in 1986. It was just a month after William Martin Smith died in his wife's arms on the sidewalk of Christian Theological Seminary. Just a month later, we had a fire at the church where I worked. Christmas night. Burned everything but the shell of the building. I do remember a lot about that evening. And I have a particularly vivid memory of standing across the street from the burning building, chatting with the fire chief, who was pointing out to me where he thought the hottest part of the fire was, and thought maybe that's where the fire had started. He said, look up at that window. You see that one window? The flames are a little different color. I think that might be where the fire started. Do you know what room of the church that is? And I said, yeah, that would be my office. There's a lot of flammable stuff in there. Desk, bookshelves, and lots of books. Back in those pre-internet days, that was kind of something. Well, a week or so later, I got a call. Amongst many calls, I got a call. Hello, Reverend Powell. This is Winnie Smith. Hi, Mrs. Smith. I believe the last time we saw each other was the night my husband passed away. Yes, of course. How are you doing? I'm okay, thanks. You know, getting by. But I do have a problem, and I wondered if you could help me with it. I saw the news about the fire at your church. Ever since Bill died, I've been wondering what in the world to do with all of his books. He had a whole room full. Would you be able to run over here and have a look? You can take whatever you want. Where was God the night William Martin Smith passed away? Where was God on the nights of those church fires so awful? Where was God this morning during the midst of all that violence? You know what I think? I think she was loosening up, getting limber, and getting ready for an Easter run.